Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to resume, and I'm jumping about with today's program. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
11, yeah.
Hey, we got 11?
Yep, you've got enough.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, those two are over in the corner there too. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's cropped up that I might well have the opportunity to see the Minister of Transport a bit later in the afternoon, so I'm just going to bring forward 12 and 13, which run together, and they really are the big items of today, despite the fact that we've managed to spend hours talking about things which weren't the big items of the day. 12 and 13 are inextricably linked. We have 12 is the infrastructure investment priority areas for investment, which sets out where we're going to do this stuff. But the contributions policy is the major event of the day as item 13. And so I'm going to talk about them as if they were one, although they're two very separate things. This is about the conflict between what ratepayers pay and what developers pay. So it's inherently confrontational between two groups. The developers want to obviously pay the least that they can, and the ratepayers don't want to have to pay for stuff that developers should have paid for. And so on the one hand, you'll have people saying, we haven't charged enough to cover the costs. And on the other hand, they'll be saying, I've charged so much we won't get any development. So it's a bit tricky. I unfortunately know quite a lot about this, having paid some DCs, and they're usually very large sums of money if you're the developer. And when you look at houses, some of these are getting up towards 100 grand a house, and so it's quite a lot of in some cases it's quite a large part of the actual house purchase. And if you're a developer and you're doing 70 or 80 houses, it's a big chunk of money. And so they don't want to pay it, but they should pay it. Not only have I paid these, I actually managed to foolishly go to court to try and oppose them, and I discovered the council has all the powers that they want. And I lost, which is a very educational experience, I can tell you. I have to say that there's a lot of reading, but for those of you who read through right through item 13's notes without even getting into the rest of it, there's a very good explanation of the options that we had there. It's a bit of a dry read, but it is a very good description of the options of how we do pay for this, and I commend you to read this. In fact, if you go through the local boards, I reckon a vast majority of them do support this, although possibly not fully understanding everything of it. Waiheke didn't come in, which is fortunate because there's not really going there, but Aoraki made a very good one. They seem to have really understood the pressures and when there's enough money, people will spend money to defend what position they're trying to be on. So there's a bit of a background. So the first bit here we're going to now, investment priority areas, is kind of the high level stuff. It's setting the very high thing. And in both cases of both items 12 and 13, I've added a small recommendation at the bottom because if you've read through item 12, you'll notice that there's a bit of a chat about the impact of changing the footpaths back from 1.8 to 1.2 and how much. That's just a small example of the fact that we will be reviewing our engineering standards a lot, and that will have an impact on things. And I just wanted to have it so that when we do these things, that can be picked up and varied in the future. Because in fact, even that example on 74 was a poor example really, because grown-up places have different council requirements for footpaths, depending on whether there's one on one side of the road or one on each side of the road. So if you've got them each side of the road, you don't have to have them so wide. And also, we are about to be more involved in AT later in the year. And our standards and AT standards are not congruous. And we have had endless discussions about the need for more stormwater, and stormwater pipes are getting bigger because there's more rain, and we're understanding that. So we have to have the ability to, that's the point of that, as standards are varied, we have to have the ability for some variation to go, some flexibility in what is very large. You have to have some flexibility looking forward 30 years, admittedly, as well. So without further ado, I'll ask.
Do you move it now?
Yeah, I will move. I'm going to move both of them right now, actually. And they'll be seconded by the Deputy Mayor, both of these, so that they're on the board. They do run together a bit. I'm going to hand over to Michael. Are you leading it, or is there a champion of detail following through?
I'll act as warm
And
up.
I have to say that there's one hell of a lot of reading in here, and as much as I pride myself as reading everything, there are a number of graphs in here that I've studied, and I'm having to take it as your word that you actually got all those numbers right, because it's just too bewildering. But you have to do all that detail, because when I lost my case over this, it was because I hadn't read the detail. And the detail, when it comes down to arguments over large sums, is where you win and lose. And so it's important that we have had that detail done. And so if you haven't managed to get it all, you'll get a good grip on this just by reading carefully again item 13's words. They're very well written on a very boring but incredibly important subject. Sorry about that big speech, but this is big stuff. Michael.
Thank you, Your Worship. So with me today, I've got Andrew Duncan and Beth Sullivan, and so we'll just give an overview to both items together, and then move into them. So items 12 and 13 are related to the investment the council will make in infrastructure to support growth, and how it looks to fairly share the costs of that investment between different groups. This is a complex but significant piece of policy that ultimately affects all Aucklanders. The focused approach to growth investment was first adopted in the 2021 long-term plan and reconfirmed last year in the LTP 24. The first report on your agenda plans out a program of infrastructure investment for these areas over the full period of their development, looking 30 years ahead. It ensures that assets are in place to support a growing and vibrant city. The second report proposes adoption of a new contributions policy. It ensures the cost of new infrastructure is fairly shared between developers and ratepayers. Without it, a disproportionate share of the cost of infrastructure would fall on ratepayers. So since consultation, the Council has gone to significant lengths to listen to a wide range of stakeholders to get the balance right as we finalise the policy. This has included carefully considering extensive feedback and reflecting the latest information around infrastructure needs and growth trends. Andrew and his team have presented the issues and options on these items to you in a number of workshops and have made themselves available for questions and discussion over the past week since this agenda was published. So given the complexity and the importance of the decisions in front of you, Andrew has a few short slides to walk through with the idea to introduce the key proposals, the options and the recommendations. So if we could have those, please.
So development contributions enable the council to recover a fair, equitable and proportionate share of the cost of investment to support growth in Auckland, to recover that from those who are developing. Now, the policy in front of you includes 19 billion of investment in projects to support growth over the next 30 years. DCs aren't the only funding source we use to help pay for this. We're looking to get 6 billion from DCs, around 6 billion from NZTA through the National Land Transport Fund for qualifying transport projects, and $6 billion for rates, from rates. If we don't get a fair share from DCs from developers, there's the risk that in the future there'll be higher demands on ratepayers to provide for this investment, or that development is delayed because infrastructure investment's delayed, or it occurs without satisfactory infrastructure in place. So the council consulted on the material and the documents in front of you for a couple of months from September last year. And since that time, we've given careful consideration to all the feedback we've received during that time period and afterwards. And all the issues raised have been carefully considered and checked. We've also done further analysis as officers, including internal reviews, substantial internal reviews, and checking of what we've put in front of you today. Now, advice in the report reflects changes to the recommendations from what we consulted on after considering the feedback and undertaking further analysis. The two biggest changes are an additional option for the nature and scale of investment in stormwater services in the Tamaki area, and to include some options for having a DC price that starts lower and rises over time, rather than the single price that we consulted on. So the first report on the agenda recommends council make a commitment to a long-term investment over 30 years in the infrastructure to support growth in the investment priority areas of Mount Roskill, Tamaki, Mangere, and the inner northwest that you've identified as priorities to support growth in your long-term plan. Now, we've got a lot of input on the proposed investment program through consultation and subsequently, and we've reviewed and updated our cost forecasts. And some of the changes reflect a revised design and costing for the active mode corridor project in Drury, and that's brought the cost down from 65 million to 20 million. Adjusting how we're delivering on improvements to manage growth and transport safety in the Auckland housing program areas, and particularly Mangere. A changed approach to how we deal with footpaths in the housing program areas to still manage the increased traffic walking traffic we're expecting to get, by moving from full widening and replacement to just extending the footpaths, and that can save 240 million over the planned 30-year investment. But the key choice in this investment commitment relates to the investment in the stormwater management in the Tamaki area, and what's required and the best approach to managing the impact that growth will have on stormwater. We're recommending an option which prioritises the investment in the upgraded pipe network to manage the impact that intensification will have in Tamaki on the hazardous flooding of roads and storm events that happen, within a 10-year period. Now, just note that all of these options have as a baseline investments in catchment scale projects in the Tamaki area to manage major flooding events. So what's being proposed in our recommended option, with the focus on the road safety, is still a significant improvement over what we would get if we didn't make those investments with the level of growth expected, but it requires less council capital investment and has a lower development contribution charge as a result. The second report you've got is recommending that you adopt the Contributions Policy 2025, Attachment A to the reports in front of you, and that would come into effect on the 1st of July 2025. Now, this updates the policy to reflect the investments referred to in the previous report, but it also updates the policy to reflect the investment commitments you made in the long-term plan across the rest of the city. The key option in front of you in this report, and there's a number of changes, but the key issue is our proposal to set a price in response to feedback, in part, received through consultation. And there was a concern that it will be fairer for development contributions prices to increase over time rather than remain flat. Of course, the flat price means you'd pay the same now as you do in 20 years. And we've got a couple of options there. Now, the single price and a price that adjusts over time are available to the council under legislation. I know most other councils do have a flat price, and we have had one historically. So we've got a couple of options for this, and what we're recommending is having prices start lower in the 25-26 year and then rise at the CPI, and that will be built from the Reserve Bank's midpoint for inflation, which at present is 2%. This means that we would still recover the full costs of growth attributable through this policy to DCs. We'd still recover that over time, so it has no effect on the council or ratepayers. But developers would pay a similar cost now and in the future, so a similar cost in real terms paid by current and future developers. So the updates we have made to the investment program and the proposed DC policy, along with the change to the pricing approach, have resulted in prices for next year that are lower than those included in the policy we consulted on last year, and you can see that on this slide here. So the current policy is in the left-hand column, and that's a single price. We consulted on a single price, the same price now as you might pay in 20 years. And the prices in the right-hand column, that's the price in the 25-26 year, it rises at 2% per year. And it also is reflecting all the changes I've just referred to in those two reports.
So thank you, Andrew. So that covers the key choices across the two papers, and we stand ready for questions.
Deputy Mayor, thank you.
Oh, thanks, Mayor. I'm not quite sure how you want to handle this. Do you want to handle questions on both?
Yeah, I think I will. The presentation is on both, but you can direct it more about one than the other. The first one's more about which areas are going to be included, but I'm not sure if that's all that controversial.
Okay, I'm not into the what so much.
Just ask about either of those two and we'll let them sort it out, but they're inextricably linked. It could have actually been one paper.
Okay, my questions are around the actual DC contribution paper, right? You can never please everybody, can you? I mean, there's always a hard job between what the developers feel is fair and what burden should be on the ratepayer. So my question is, did the developers ever come to you with a kind of a joint proposal from the group themselves that would give us a bit of a steer from a number of them? Did they ever come back, to say, no, we don't like what you're proposing, but as a group, we think something else should apply? Did they ever do that?
A number of developers did suggest that we continue with our current approach of looking ahead 10 years and adjusting that at 3-year cycles with each LTP as we do at present. However, we've explored that alternative and presented it, comments on it in the report. If we were to do that, look, would have an impact on ratepayers, depending on which projects you count, $700 to $800 million over a decade or so, because the projects that we would be needing to do beyond 10 years now, we wouldn't get a share of those costs from the developers who develop early, and yet they're driving some of the need for that investment. Of course, what we've proposed price-wise means that the early developers are paying a bit less in real terms than the later ones, so there's an element of managing the impact on early developers reflected in the pricing proposed.
So that was my second question. This is point 20 in the report, right? Because I think this one is the one that I really want to hone into. So they are saying there's too much uncertainty in the future scale, pace and location of growth and the costs of infrastructure over a 30-year period, right? That's what they're saying. So for us to say, no, that's not right, because ratepayers would end up by paying more, you kind of talk big numbers, but I kind of want to think of it as rates increases, or I want to get a little bit more. Michael, do you need, I'm happy to wait for other people's questions while someone does the math, but what I just can't see, I'm trying to get in my head, is that balance between the developers, which it sounds a reasonable thing. They're saying, look, leave it as it is because we're just not sure. And you're saying, well, actually, if you do leave it like that, the ratepayers have to pick up the tab. And what I can't find, or please direct me in the paper if I can't put my finger on it, is the specifics. What's in it for what is the detrimental effect for ratepayers?
So we've estimated that about $700 to $800 million over the time. I suppose the key thing for us is we have done the work to look at what the cost is over the full term of the development. And that's why, it's part of why the council's gone to prioritising certain areas, because the work involved in planning out all of the infrastructure that would be needed to accommodate the full projected growth is pretty intense. And it's taken us a number of years. I mean, Drury has taken a number of years, same with the Northwest, and we're only partway there for those AHP areas. So what I suppose the key point is, yes, there is always uncertainty, and especially about the future, but we have done a lot of work and a lot of analysis to assess what infrastructure will be needed over the long term to support the growth we're seeing and forecasting in Auckland, and how much that might cost.
So if I was to put it really simply, you're saying stepping back from the developers and stepping back from the ratepayer, this is the fairest balance between the two groups to deliver the outcomes that we need. Would that be a correct statement?
Yes.
There's whatever we do, there's a tension here, and as I try to get the ones who don't want to pay will say it's going to put the price of houses up too much, and the other ones will say, well, we don't want to end up having to cop up later on for libraries and swimming pools, which will inevitably be asked for. And so
that's point 21, isn't it? Because is it true that higher DCs would lead to higher house prices?
Not necessarily. What happens is, if it's greenfields, and I've experienced of this, if you know it's going to be $60,000, $70,000 for a DC ahead, you'll do your analysis on the value of the land then the guy selling the land will try and sell it as if there was no DCs and get more. And the guys buying it will have to be sensible enough to know that we've actually got to cough up $64,000 for each of these houses, so the land's not worth nearly as much. So you annoy, what this does is it mostly annoys farmers flogging land who think they're going to get more, or Fletchers who bought land at too high a price before they realise what's coming, which isn't a bad thing really. And so it means that you've got to be very careful when you wander into this. And I think giving these out ahead is absolutely a good, clear thing to do, because otherwise you get, why I went to court was because this was sprung on me later on. And I thought, yeah, that's not fair, as it turned out to be. Councils have a lot of power in these things, so we've got to get it right. So we are protecting the future, or the current residents and future residents of areas, because when you hear in Drury, they're claiming it's going to be as big as Napier. Well, that's not going to happen in 10 years, but it probably will happen. And so that's why they've gone from 10 years and out to 30 years, because these are long-term projects. And a lot of subdividers will tell you that 5 years is bloody quick to get even a small one going, from buying land to having sections sold. And so I think they've got a bit of flexibility by having the prices varying over a period of time. So they've discounted the long-term one so that you start a bit cheaper now. It covers off a couple of things. We get some cash in the bank early, but on the other hand, they haven't built everything. But inevitably, the new city of Napier at Drury is going to require all the things that councils put in. And that's not in what typically as a developer I would pay for the roads and the footing and all that hard stuff that you see, and it's still there. But you try and close your eyes and not think about what you've done to the town. And I think you find that they're lower in the Auckland regional because that's a lot of the stuff is already there, and so we're not punishing the people for it. But it's as admittedly as we've got all those graphs in there, it's not an exact science, and I think you've done well coming up with something or other. Just explain to everybody, Andrew, what flexibility will remain here. I've also added in a last one onto the recommendations about the fact that we'll be reviewing standards on the way through, because you might have read a bit about 1.8 footpaths, and not doing those saves a lot of money, but we need to review our standards because they're all over the place and they're not defendable. And we have to have the ability that we're not overcharging or under collecting. And I'd be surprised if we get it, if whatever we decide is the best effort we've got, and it won't be exact. Is that right? You answer. I'm wandering into your territory, but
yes, there is uncertainty, as both yourself and the Deputy Mayor have said, Your Worship. As Michael pointed out, there's a great deal of in-depth planning and information being undertaken, and we have the flexibility. We're required to update our DC policy every 3 years. The council updates its long-term investment plans in that cycle as well, and that gives us the opportunity to respond to new information, new forecasts of growth as they occur. But as you pointed out, we are looking long-term, given the scale of growth that's forecast for Auckland and the scale of the infrastructure we require to support that, and we feel that it's appropriate to plan on that same time horizon. The forecast for Auckland's growth over the next 30 years, another 600,000 people coming to Auckland, and we need to make provision for them, and by taking a long-term view, it enables us to do that.
And just finally, Your Worship, if I may, so as a result of the feedback from developers, you have started from a lower figure than what you went out for consultation with, haven't you?
Yes. So we've reviewed from the consultation, reviewed all of the numbers again, and looked at each item that they've proposed or suggested or asked we look at, gone through all that, and then one of the key points was this idea of whether we should stick with a flat price or have one that starts lower, ends higher, but still collects the same amount. And as we've done that, you've ended up with those numbers on the right in bold, and in each case they mean that the charge for next year, from 1 July for the first year, will be less than was proposed in our consultation document.
Councillor Newman, please.
Your Worship, I've got a number of questions. I listened to your question or preamble, but I'm not quite sure. I'll have a go with the officers, and thank you for your work. Nowhere in the Local Government Act does it state that we have to design a development contributions policy on the basis of a question of affordability, the outcome of how much a house is going to cost. So I don't really understand why we'd be raising the issue of house prices with respect to contributions. This is a matter of what is the cost of the growth and how is that allocated based on causation, the principles, benefits received. I prefer the consultation proposal amounts in Drury myself. Just going through the schedules for the policy, it's a lot of information to try to understand, but a lot of these costs in relation to Drury actually start fundamentally with the cost of the land that's going to be required for this infrastructure. The cost of that is only going to go up over time, but we're going to go with a lower price point to begin with for an investment which is only going to have to appreciate based on the value of the land as we look to purchase it. Is that right?
We have built the cost base based on the cost we expect to pay at the time we expect to pay it. So the expenditure side of the calculation is based on the nominal costs at the time we expect to pay them, not in today's dollars. So that's been one of the things that's been pointed out by the developers, is that we have looked to forecast how much parcels of land or construction costs will need to be 15 to 20 years away, and considering that and built that into the costs we need to recover, and part of the discussion around using kind of an indexed pricing was to balance that out.
Okay, so if we look at, for example, transport, the transport development contribution is based on the schedule of projects as described in attachment B, and that's pretty well it now. For Drury, we're not looking to revisit the program for investment, the design of that. This is, unless we want to fundamentally go and restart the policy debate again, this is it?
Yes. And in looking at those costs, the price that escalates over time will recover the full costs that are set out in the policy.
Okay, it's a lot of information. With respect...
Sorry, just to correct that, or to add to that, sorry. There is, for Drury, for some parts of Drury, there is still work underway for additional investments in around the Opahiki and parts of Drury West. So those will come into the policy once we're able to do that work. That's in Para 136. Yep.
Yeah. Does that require a consequential adjustment on the price? Because to me, this just doesn't look like it's enough to cover for the infrastructure that will probably be required there.
So our transport team will look at the development additional that Michael referred to and consider what those costs are. We would then look at adding those to our investment plans and the DC policy. That may only impact part of the Drury area, not all of it, depending on the nature of the investments.
Hang on, transport's a network, a growth-related network in that part of Auckland, so I would assume that we would want to try and get the contribution spread within the border Drury as opposed to a granular sort of assessment of...
Definitely, but Drury is quite a large area. It's going to have, I think, 22,000 houses, so we just need to check it isn't just one part of Drury, but all of it that fits in that network context, or whether it's a subcomponent of the network. It's just some technical stuff, but yes.
And one other question at this stage, Your Worship, is when do you expect the report back on the update for that assessment? I mean, there's a lot more in the transport space to come, and that's even before Mill Road, albeit Mill Road is obviously Crown as opposed to us.
Yeah, so there's a number of items in the next steps of both these papers where work is continuing. I can't give you a timeline for when we'll look to come back with those. Part of that we'll need to take into account the work that the government are currently doing and re-looking at how local government recover the cost of growth infrastructure. And they're looking and have announced the start of the year that they're looking to bring in legislation to introduce development levies. Once we know the shape and timelines for that for them, then we'll need to consider the value in updating the DC policy in the meantime.
Just one final, Your Worship. I'm assuming that after our discussion the other day and reflecting on the open space policy work, that beyond all of this, you're going to have to go through those locations, peri-urban locations, which are going to expect a whole lot of growth for the pocket parks and land, because that's going to have to be part of your subsequent update as well.
Yes, correct.
Good questions, good answers. Councillor Sayers.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. I might just pick up on Desley's earlier questions, Deputy Mayor's earlier questions around the feedback from the developers. So I just don't want to make an assumption here, that's all. Was there any significant risk or concern around the figures or the modelling that we were using, presenting to them to make decisions from feedback? Like, were they comfortable with the data that we were providing?
So through the consultation process, there were a number of items identified where we'd made errors or they had questioned some of our numbers. We've been through, double-checked those, corrected them. We came back to you and mentioned those in our workshops. Subsequent to that, we've checked them again and again. But yes, and we've gone through and looked at those and checked everyone.
Thank you for that. Andrew, this one's probably for you, and that's just at the I came to the drop-in session, what, was it yesterday? Yeah, and I mentioned about there could be a paper coming from a Mr. Bill Foster from the Northern Action Group. I just wondered if you'd received that yet and if you intend. Okay, that's all right. Hope just when you do receive that, I just hope you might be able to digest and reply to it. That's all. And my concern around all of this is that, and understanding how it all works, there's in the unitary plan we have growth nodes and growth cities, and I'm aware of one particularly because it's Warkworth, and they've got structure plans in the unitary plan, and we know the population is going to grow there. Yet there's only identified areas that they can get the DCs in there to cope with the growth. Just by example, because I'm familiar with it, Warkworth's due to grow from 7,000 to 20,000+, but within half that time, it's probably going to reach that number. So my question is just what options are there for other areas that might have structure plans that need DCs in them to cope with the growth, not just not the immediate growth, but there's also all the reserves and everything around that's associated with it. So what options are there for those parts of Auckland that find themselves in that situation to get the adequate funding to put in the infrastructure in advance of that housing?
Thank you for the question. Yes, so we had a bit of think following our conversation. So this is one of the challenges with the DC regime. And to address that, the council brought in this idea of infrastructure priority areas. So there were specific areas where the council would plan for growth to occur, and part of the idea was to clearly signal to the market, to developers and ratepayers where we would be and where we wouldn't be prioritising infrastructure investment. And so we didn't signal or plan a full suite of growth infrastructure investment in Warkworth, and much of the growth in Warkworth is the result of private plan changes. Given DCs are a cost recovery mechanism, we can only charge them where we've planned for that growth infrastructure. I think this is one of the pros of where the government are looking to go with their new scheme. One of their stated aims is something that's more responsive to where growth occurs and allows councils to be more agile in responding So hopefully that will enable us to do what you've suggested and be more responsive.
Councillor Fletcher, please.
Thank you. I don't want to get, I welcome the fact that the Mayor has set the scene for being able to have this discussion around priority areas along with developer contributions, because I find it's like a jigsaw. We're bringing all these pieces together of planning work, and so it's important for me that I've got in my head the sort of principles that are going to underpin this. And what I want to test out, I don't want to get at this point to uncertainty and fairness about planning and cost escalations, because I think that's a rabbit hole that I don't want to go down just yet. I want to have a comfort in the scene setting, and I want to bring it into the context of all the other, we've been doing the open space policies, and we're doing a lot with the planning committee on enabling growth there. What is of concern to me is in identifying these areas here of the inner northwest, Mangere, Mount Roskill and Tamaki, it begs the question that with a lot of what is proposed for growth, there's a lot more brownfield. And I'm just trying to find the section that I'm just wanting to query you specifically on. I was looking at last night. We have consistently underestimated the cost of infrastructure in brownfield areas. And I really just want to tease that out a little bit more, because it then comes into what we later might decide to do around developer contributions. So just as an assumption at this point, I'd like you to speak to, in some ways, greenfield areas are easier at this point because you're starting afresh. But brownfield it proves to be a lot more problematic. And the assumptions are that somehow it will be, I'm trying to find the section here on brownfields, the assumption is that it will be less costly, and that because there's already an infrastructure in there. Whereas what we do know is brownfield can be quite expensive. Do you want to just speak to that in a general way initially?
There's a couple of elements to that. First of all, some investment in brownfield areas, and even the ones where we're looking at quite intense development over and planning for that over 30 years that we've got on the screen there, doesn't cost as much as starting from scratch in the greenfields. And that would particularly apply to transport. However, there are some investments in the brownfield areas that do require more council investment, and that will be particularly evident in looking at what's required for stormwater in Tamaki. Now, it's not free in the greenfield areas, but the developers finance and do that investment. Whereas in the brownfield areas, where the development's going to be intense enough to require investment to manage stormwater impacts, we have to dig up the existing roads. It's a lot more expensive to do that than a developer to do it when they do other investment in the greenfields. The second element of your question is that the council staff have looked very carefully at the costings for providing the investment in the brownfield areas, using our own expertise and the expertise of external consultants to do as good a job as they can of figuring out what it might cost in these areas.
I'll come back. It's difficult dealing with both items together, but I'm just not quite persuaded on the modelling, on the costings around brownfield vis-a-vis greenfield areas at the moment. But I certainly really welcome that we are trying to better understand the cost of growth and costing out infrastructure. It's something I really, really want to see achieved, but just this brownfield issue is still troubling me. Thanks.
Thank you for that, councillor, and I do understand that is why I brought the two together, because they're a bit hard to separate. They have impacts on each other, so questions across both and further clarity as the debate goes on is fine. Councillor Turner, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm looking at the figures. The inner northwest has jumped to the highest number now, basically, and I'm thinking of the situations where like the Red Hills development, where 400 houses were allowed to go live before they were connected to sewerage, and is now having tankering take place, etc. Is this dollar value for the Northwest having a playing a catch-up role in there?
So the investments proposed for the Northwest don't include water and wastewater. That's provided for by Watercare, so it's not included in our policy. There isn't the investments that have been planned out here reflect what's needed to support the growth, some of which has already happened, but that we need looking into the future. To the extent the growth has already happened, that cost is not being passed on to the developers that will occur next. That falls onto the existing ratepayers. In part, that's why it's important if we adopt this policy now, it means developers who develop from this time or lodge their consents from this time will be paying a fair share of the costs of the investment required there. I think the growth forecast in the northwest, that broader area, is getting up to the size of, maybe not quite Tauranga, but Napier Tauranga size of a city developing in that area.
Thank you. I have spoken to the Watercare board when I've been there and asked how their IGCs are meshing with these policies, and they seemed satisfied that and they said that there'd been a lot of work between the two, you guys and them. So, again, as everyone says, it's pretty complex stuff, and I have to rely on your professionalism and expertise. But I understand what you've just said. I would, also just flop that back onto it might be the water infrastructure I mentioned, but it's the other infrastructure seems to be trailing in the same sort of manner. Some of my questions about flexibility have been answered. I've got here written down here flexibility and agility. I've had a number of people reach out to me, as to all of us, and some individually, and I've had people complaining from opposing sides of the argument, which worries me that it's not entirely correct. So you did mention, though, about this being reviewed in 3 years along with the LTP. It'd be a 3-year review. So what is the agility? This is a long-term plan, but what is the agility to manoeuvre should we find we've got something fundamentally wrong, or would you argue there isn't anything fundamentally wrong?
No, that's always a possibility. And, the council has a number of ways in which we can respond. So, yes, we will need to update the policy in 3 years because the council will adopt a new long-term plan. And given a change in the investment commitment and the projected cost of that, then the contributions policy would need to be updated to recover that cost. If the intentions were wrong, that were changed, or if, for example, the costs came in significantly under, then there's a mechanism for the council to address that and pay back DCs if in the ultimate case.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to turn my camera off. My phone's going flat. So the last question, from what developers and people who've got in touch with me have said, is that we're just going to drive that development out of the inner northwest and to the cheapest place available. So Mangere, for instance, or with that huge discrepancy between the lowest number and the highest numbers, is that a valid comment that they've made?
So this is something that we've given careful consideration to, and His Worship answered it in part by referring to the impact that DCs have on land prices. And once that's been reflected, we would expect developers to build where people want to buy houses. And some people already want to buy in Mangere, and some already want to buy elsewhere. That'll be reflected in the overall market for houses, and the underlying market for land prices is already starting to reflect some of the DCs. So there will be some movement in the short to medium term, but we expect in the longer term land prices will move to an equilibrium and development will occur where people want to buy houses.
I suppose the other point to make here is the purpose of the policy, right? So the purpose of a contributions policy is to fairly share the planned and experienced costs of the infrastructure investment. There is no purpose of the policy to drive demand towards one area or another, or think that maybe other things that look to achieve that, but that's not the contributions policy. Contributions policy is about fair sharing of the costs. And so we can only charge to an area a charge related to the costs that serve growth in that area.
I think, Ken, you might know that jump there might suggest that the 25 grand was wrong. It's an area which I probably in the past have underestimated the stormwater problems out in the northwest. And so just because someone got away in the past doesn't mean we shouldn't do something about it for the future. I think
fair enough. And if it brings better rate drains and maintenance, then I'm happy.
Well, you want to pay for all those drains to be cleaned, but I want to pay to make sure we've got some drains to be cleaned. Okay.
Good.
Councillor Hills, please.
Order, and apologies again for not being in person and for my voice. The few questions, I guess, thanks for the changes. I obviously support this direction because it's a limited tool we have, but was very concerned about some of those costs at the beginning. My concern is, and I guess to Councillor Fletcher's point, it does show that actually most of the time the brownfield is about half of what the greenfield is. But my concern is still with Tāmaki. I know the policy will say that it doesn't make a huge difference, but because the discrepancy will create a donut essentially for Tāmaki, what is our kind of economic advice or the advice here on that quite dramatic cost for that suburb? Or is it just unavoidable because there is no stormwater there right now, or very little?
Yes, you're right in regard to the stormwater question. And so there will be the investments that are proposed will ensure that the development that's going to occur in Tāmaki happens with a good level of stormwater service. If you're looking at the comparative costs from a developer's perspective between Tāmaki and the greenfield area, in Tāmaki you'll get all the things that DCs covers, including stormwater, for say the 71,000 if you're connecting to the network we're going to invest in. If you're in the northwest, you'll pay 72,000 to the council for transport, parks and community facilities, and then you'll have to go and build the stormwater works yourself as you develop. So the comparative cost will be higher by that than is what is reflected on the board here.
Okay, and the elsewhere in the region figure staying the same in the end, are you saying that's not really the same because we're using the CPI over time, so it actually does cater for what we need?
Yes.
The 20 to 20. Oh, there was a yes. Sorry.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. the feedback we've had from some of the local boards, I still feel like people don't necessarily understand the policy. If you look through the spreadsheets, there's hundreds of projects that have already been completed or half completed, or were, there's some parks on the North Shore that you've got on the funding list that were purchased or built like when I was a kid. So can you just explain a little bit, because of course local boards start going, well, why don't you put these 9 projects in? We're still claiming development contributions for projects that have happened. Can you just explain how that works? Not just for me to explain it to them, but I think there's a bit of a confusion that it's new money for new things and we'll all be excited because suddenly I've got 1,000 new residents and they can build 1,000 new things in my ward.
Yeah, so, and this is one of the reasons why this is highly complex. The team, when building the policy, go through each project by project, and resultant asset by asset, and establish what capacity that can serve. And serving that capacity can take, like as you've mentioned, in examples of some of the parks purchases or large transport infrastructure, for example, filling that capacity can take decades. And it's most appropriate that we still continue to recover the cost of that investment over the decades that it takes for that capacity to be fully taken up.
And that's why, in part, it supports the argument for looking 30 years ahead in these areas we've identified as investment priorities.
So it might happen the other way. Because can we do we talk about, because obviously we're paying interest on that capital now that we've borrowed that we'll pay back with DCs. Does that get considered? Because I think on the North Shore, it was about $60 million worth of DCs that had been spent but not collected yet.
Yeah, so any interest that's related to the DC policy is built into the DC price. So if we were to buy something now that's going to serve over a bunch of time, that the interest would come through to the DC price.
Okay, and I think a lot of the feedback from the developers was, these prices seem out of whack, and of course we've gone back and you have changed some of those. But how do we, and it's a broader comment, right, and it probably is to the Mayor and Revenue Committee's better value projects work, but how do we get a change in the approach from the big players? Sadly, I look at some of these figures and think, yes, they look overinflated now. Probably when they're built, we'll be charged double what we've expected. Is there more work going on and how we can get better procurement and reduce these costs? Because it does seem eye-watering, the expectations. But sadly, what I've seen, if you look 10 years ago, the prices end up being, I guess, what they are. But is there more work that will help this over time? Because that's what I think the concern is.
Yes, I think you're correct. That projects like the better value projects, the new rules we've brought through our financial strategy are all focused on ensuring that council gets best value, and we will continue to update our forecast costs as we've mentioned before. As we go through each long-term plan process, we'll be updating those cost forecasts for the latest information we have.
I'd also note that Michael and some of my colleagues are working with some of the bigger developers to see whether there are opportunities to work alongside them to bring some of these investments forward, which would both have benefits for the cost of the investment that would flow through to ratepayers and developers, but also to allow development to proceed. And if they can come up with something that's a win-win for both sides, I'm sure that they will look to take those opportunities. So,
and could that drop the land cost component of some of these assets, which seem to be big costs?
Yes. Of course, one of the things with the land cost is we've worked closely with Beth, with the real estate agents, experts.
I just lost you if you're still speaking.
Andrew's over to me.
Good.
Yes,
Sorry.
So we've worked with various experts around the pricing of land and things like that, and for the forecasting of land going forward.
Okay. And the last question, I guess.
One of the things with land going forward, of course, is that while we may have some high costs in there, based on that expertise Beth referred to, often it might be some of the major developers that we're buying that land off.
Yeah. Right. So it's a bit cyclical. Okay. And the last comment, so you've got a third up there, NZTA council, rates DCs. But if you incorporate the funding we're picking up for previous projects or projects that have purchased free now, do we have an idea of the overall percentage of what the DCs actually pay for? Like on some of the list, it says it's only 20% of a project. The rest, I assume, is rates. But overall, is it a third, you think?
We'd have to go away and check that one. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Maybe one of the things there, Richard, is that the big projects are episodic. You know, we put in a big stormwater system, and we will have collected some of the DCs before that's done and some of them after that's done, and it will all add up to be the right amount of money, because the development and availability of sections is more steady, but the actual provision of big roads or big stormwater systems is episodic. So this has to have, there will be times when people can say, oh, we've paid already and it hasn't happened. But without that, it won't happen. And there'll be other people who say, well, there you are, you've had it, and now why are we having to pay for it? Because, and if we've heard, as I think Councillor Turner said, that he's had people saying on both sides of the argument, saying we've got it wrong, probably tells me we've got it right. Because there will be developers who think it's costing too much, and there'll be other people who are saying it's not enough. So there you go. Councillor Bartley, please.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. My question is around Tamaki. I suppose I'm seeking clarification, reassurance that what we will support or put through doesn't mean flooding is going to happen in the areas that are not connected to the main road networks. And I ask that because I also see point 127 in the risks that the target service standards may not be achieved if property owners fail to properly maintain on-site systems.
So I can answer that one through the chair. The proposed network upgrades in our alternative option address not just the areas that where there's hazardous flooding on major roads, but also pick up large areas of the catchment that have no stormwater at the moment that is served by soakage. So we believe that the proposed upgrades address the most significant public risks. The pipe network is not there to solve large-scale flooding. It's there to solve the nuisance flooding and road flooding in like a 1 in 10 year scale event. So it's about drainage, the management of nuisance, more so than resolving large-scale flooding. There are large-scale flooding projects within the policy, such as the stabilisation of Amaru Creek, boundary reserve, and so forth, and those are the big projects that are targeted, and they are within both options.
Okay, all right. That's reassurance. Yep, thank you. My other question is around the move from 10 years to 30 years. And this is following on from jury, and I just need to know, are we treating the rest of these areas like a one-size-fits-all with Drury? Because do we have any certainty around the costs that will be needed in 30 years' time, and noting that it's also identified as a risk in point 124 about the uncertainty of future costs? So should we be going ahead with the move to 30 years?
While we're applying that methodology from Drury, i.e. the moving to a 30 years across, we're basing the cost estimates and the growth forecasts on specific analysis that the teams have done for each area. For example, in areas such as Tamaki, Mount Roskill and Mangere, we're working really closely with Kaingaora, who are, the dominant landholder in those areas, and working with them really closely on what their plans are for the areas, and then also alongside that, detailed work on the investment required. Sorry.
Just to add that we have developed a specific brownfield costing methodology for transport and for stormwater for Tamaki. That was the first time that we've done this, so that's going to be a template for brownfields going forward. But as we go into other areas, we will review it specifically for each area.
Okay, thank you.
And the underlying methodology that's been used was developed for Drury, that's now been developed for the brownfields. We had that reviewed before we proceeded with Drury by Deloitte's, and we've taken into account the feedback they gave us in 2022, and the work that Beth's referring to has been substantially supported. Becca for transport, and I think Alta is the name of the stormwater company that was helping our team. So it's our internal expertise and external expertise.
Thank you. That counts. Deputy Mayor Simpson, please.
Sorry, Mayor, to come back to me again, but I'm just trying to be really clear what would happen if we don't agree to this, right? So if we don't agree to this, is it true we will forego early developer revenue that will impose at least 1.1 billion on ratepayers, which is the equivalent to a 44% rates rise? Or it floods. Or
It is correct that not adopting this policy means that the council will will not be able to recover some of the costs of its investment over time, and or will need to withhold some of that investment and place reduce service levels or place additional risks to Aucklanders.
All that happens is that the developers make a windfall, and it doesn't result in cheaper houses. Everyone just create a windfall, or either that we're creating a hole for problems for ratepayers in the future, and as they don't do stuff, because we talked about cleaning drains, we've got to have some drains to clean, and so this is a very, very important thing that we do, and I think we've heard that it's been very well analysed. I think that the team over there have presented a very complex thing, both in the written and the answers forms, to make this worthwhile. So I thank you for the high quality of questions and debate, and you guys can step back, and if we have to have a debate, we will done, but essentially we did that. Okay, Karen wants to have first round at the debate.
Last question. It was just to say, really, because obviously it's a big jump in the amount. So, do you think that we've been behind in actually making those decisions to increase them?
It is true that people have begun development in these areas, and because we haven't planned for the investment, and we're not able to, and are only now putting this policy through, that they have paid less than they would have paid, they would be paying from 1 July. So, yes.
Good question, good answer. Thank you. Step back. Anybody want to debate about this now? Well, that was a fairly debatable thing there. Councillor Sayers wants to debate it. Isn't it?
Yeah, I'm just
area where they probably should have charged more, I should say.
I'm going to just push the point about areas of Auckland that are under heavy growth that aren't receiving the any DC funding. I understand the whole context of it, but I just need to put the argument forward because it's not just in Rodney, but there are many other wards that are under the same pressure and others that might not even know they're going to be under this pressure because the private plan change hasn't gone through and suddenly created that pressure. So I guess it really comes back to this idea of these IPAs and all being foreshadowed and take so long to calculate and you know, because of that process, areas like, and I'll just use, again, not trying to be too parochial, but I do understand the Walkwest situation, where they can't be reflected in the 10-year plan. It's just not there yet. The growth is real, it's happening today as we speak, and it's happening elsewhere across other councils' areas as well. And we can't get access to any funding. So it's all back to front. The cart is leading the horse, it would seem to me, rather than the other way around. What we actually need is a pool of money that can be tapped into and used to provide the infrastructure, the roads, the parks, etc., the community facilities, as and when required. Just looking at my notes to make sure I haven't missed anything there. You know, it's this funding also, look, we have regional parks, we have tourists, we have Aucklanders travelling all over the place to visit key areas. If we don't have those areas up to scratch and fit for purpose, it not only impacts immediate residents, but it's also, you know, all those visitors. I'm thinking the ones travelling up to those beautiful regional parks, enjoying those. We want those kept, and we need to develop them and get the management plans across the line. We have tourists coming in and wanting to enjoy those same beautiful jewels in the crown of right across all of Auckland. Won't be able to get there and enjoy them. So I'm happy to probably support this, Your Worship, but I just wanted to make the argument that, and the only light seems to be at the moment, you know, this levy coming through the central government at some stage to try and make this a better situation where the horse is in front of the cart. Thank you.
I think that, I think you're in an area where some of the people are saying these aren't big enough, but it's not an exact thing. I think we've got pretty good. Right over, that's all I've got there, so I'm going to have a nerve of try and move these there. Consequential, number 12 has to be passed for number 13 to make sense, so all those in favour of number 12, please say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, carried. Number 13.
Aye.
Oh, number 13, please say aye. Aye. Contrary, carried.
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Walker.
Sorry, Mayor, what was in the red that was scrolled?
That's okay.
It's easy for you to say. The bit at the bottom, we just added that we are going to review standards because our standards are not agreement across the thing. And just to have flexibility, so if that produces in a lower or upper one, that goes into the case along with the other flexibilities. But I think you just passed a very important
Point of order, Your Worship.
set of documents here.
The issue with some of the stuff, and I mean, it may well, you might regard a better value product, but I mean, if potentially a shared path gets reduced down to a small footpath, I'm not sure that's better value. I've been getting some projects that I want that you would probably regard as gold plating, but they're there for a specific purpose, and I'm not quite sure the benefit of that, because that's quite a subjective.
It's just giving a bit of flexibility to show that if and when we get our standards, design standards right, which they're not at the moment, they're all over the place, that we still have a defensible way of slightly adjusting so that we don't put at risk the whole process of development contributions. It's kind of just a little bit of a flexibility. I think lack of flexibility will sometimes drop us in the pub financially anyhow, so I'm happy with that.
The issue is, Your Worship, I don't know, you've already passed it, you declared it carried, but I'm sorry, it is difficult to understand who's going to. I mean, developers will argue that the you've already passed it, so I can't intervene, have I?
If it gives councillors some comfort, I don't think this necessarily presumes a reduction in standards. It simply seeks that we're doing some work, which is what we actually committed to do, through, management-wise, through the Better Value Projects work in any event. So
I'm almost sure it'll be a bit of both. I think you might find some of the rating standards might get cheaper, but I think this stormwater standards will go the other way. Okay, Councillor Darby.
Sorry, you've gone back to the other one. Just a question on the Auckland Housing Program. A lot of this work is premised on that big focus in, Roskill and other areas. What is the status of the funding agreement on the Auckland Housing Program that I think, are we still awaiting government to sign up to that agreement? Is anybody, sorry, I should have asked this earlier, but.
Yeah, can we just a point of order? I just want to clarify because it's all passed. Can we get them answered offline?
I was just saying, look, I'm not entirely sure about the actual agreement, but we have met with Kāinga Ora and they did get budget or retained budget in the latest government budget decisions around the large-scale projects. It is a limited time frame, I understand, so they're working it through as well. And I know that KO are also working directly with Tamaki Regeneration Company as well in terms of the budget they have for that Tamaki area as well.
It just appears from some of the public statements ministers have made is that they're backpedaling, like the whole development program of Kāinga Ora has shrunk. More than half of the staff have been expunged, and so the future does not look like there is a development program. So, and the premise of that is that there is a major anchor in Auckland of the Auckland Housing Program, and we're hanging our hats on that and signalling to the balance of the development community that we shall charge accordingly. And I'm a little bit troubled by the actual situation. It appears, that's unconfirmed, but it appears that the public sector housing program led by government is being shrunk so severely.
I might be able to throw a bit of light on that. You'll know that I've been very concerned about the lack of progress at Mangawhau Station, which is probably our biggest opportunity in the city for a major infusion of population in a concentrated manner. And one of the blocks there is Kāinga Ora, and it is unknown, so it's going. That block will become into our influence as to what happens there, and I think that the private sector will be encouraged to take up. A lot of what Kāinga Ora is holding is for private sector development, and I think that they do own the land, and they'll be bringing more private sector into that, and that's what's supposed to happen to make up for that. But it will have some impact, mostly on the government's finances rather than ours, and it doesn't impact upon the need for us to be collecting development contributions. In fact, it makes it even more important that we do that.
Look, probably for the Policy and Planning Committee, but it would be good to get an update on what we actually do know about the direction that government is taking on the Auckland Housing Program.
Through the chair, look, absolutely, and so we've had an initial conversation with Kāinga Ora to understand it. They're still understanding it, and I'm happy to do that through Councillor Hills. Yeah.
Okay, we're done on that one. Thanks very much. I'm going to go back to item 11, and I'll welcome the group back here.